Tonight on Nation to Nation, the political panel debates the latest problems besetting the National Inquiry.
We're still continuing to see what looks like dysfunction in the inquiry, more resignations, more firings. It's upsetting to the families.
Is government policy interfering? Canada's Auditor General reports that Health Canada has no idea if its oral care programs for Indigenous people are working.
The health outcomes for those populations is significantly worse than the health outcomes, the dental health outcomes for the rest of Canadians.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. Hello, I'm Todd Lam. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls wrapped up hearings in Saskatoon today, but it's been another rocky week. On Tuesday, it was hit by another resignation. Iqaluit lawyer Joseph Murdoch-Flowers abruptly quit, saying he would not comment further. 8 resignations or firings have occurred since the beginning of the month. On November 1st, Chief Commissioner Marion Bowler delivered a preliminary report, partly blaming the government for being too tight-fisted. The issue came up in question period yesterday.
The Prime Minister said he would review the report and pay attention to its recommendations, but nothing's changed. The Liberals have broken their promise to families that they would do everything in their power to help this vital inquiry succeed. When will they finally put words into action and bring this national tragedy to an end?
Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations.
Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to ending this ongoing national tragedy and to ensure that the Commission has all the support it needs to succeed. We have heard and take very seriously the concerns raised about how existing government policy and processes were impeding their work. A working group has been created to provide effective back-office support to the Commission to ensure it is able to do its work effectively. Our government remains fully committed to ensuring that families get the answers they have been waiting for.
The honourable member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
And joining me now is Don Rusnick, Parliamentary Secretary for Indigenous Services, I always get that mixed up, Cathy McLeod, Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, and Sheila Malcolmson, NDP MP and critic for the status of women. Thank you for joining me. Now I'm going to start with you, Ms. Malcolmson. You were up in question period just yesterday. What did you think of the answer that Minister Bennett gave you?
Minister Bennett's been giving the same answer really ever since the inquiry is launched. We keep asking her, are you as a government doing everything you can to support the success of the inquiry? The country needs it so badly to work so well. The families, the survivors are counting on it. We just keep getting one headline after the next about interference or bureaucratic roadblocks, the role of the Privy Council office. And despite the strong commitments of the Prime Minister and Minister Bennett, we're still continuing to see what looks like dysfunction in the inquiry, more resignations, more firings. It's upsetting to the families, and we're pushing the government as hard as they can to keep their promise.
But how much of this can, I know some of it can be laid at the feet of the government perhaps, but how much of it is just internal dysfunction that has nothing to do with what the Liberal government does?
When we get reports both from the commissioners themselves and from investigative journalism saying that it takes months to have even a computer system approved through the Privy Council office, that the Privy Council office itself has held $2 million out of the $500 million attributed so far to the inquiry, that in fact when the commissioners were on their first day of work were just given a paper terms of reference, the government had done nothing to lease them offices or establish even a shared drive, and a year later they still have nothing. They hired or they appointed commissioners who were supposed to do the hard work of getting out into communities, listening to families, and nailing some solutions to the systemic problems that led to this epidemic of murdered and missing Indigenous women. I don't think any of them thought that they were going to have to be IT experts. This isn't how the TRC ran, especially under the leadership of Marie Sinclair, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
And the Conservative government.
And so, you know, and our focus entirely as New Democrats is on the government. We're not wanting to undermine the commissioners, but we want the government to keep its promise to make the inquiry go as well as it can.
Ms. McLeod, you tweeted earlier this week about the latest resignation is just more red flags. What did you mean specifically when you said red flags?
I think since the last year, there have been, with every resignation, with every report, with the hundreds of signatures on a letter, those are red flags that the minister should be listening to. And we have to recognize that TRC had some challenges, and it took a lot of work to get it back on track, and then it did a fantastic job. So I think it's important to look at these red flags and say, what are we going to do? But, you know, part of a job of committee, and this is really a disappointment, we had the interim report. My colleague Arnold Learson said, you know, we need to perhaps get the PCO here to have them sort of explain what's happening and to perhaps inquire a little more deeply into it. And, you know, certainly whenever he brings that motion up, all he wants is a quick vote to say, you know, let's get the PCO here, let's have a conversation about what's happening. He gets shut down. So, you know, that's a job of a committee to look at what's happening. And of course, very disappointing that we keep getting shut down on that aspect.
Of course, you sit on the committee. You're a non-voting member as a parliamentary secretary. I guess why hasn't the Indigenous Affairs Committee taken this up and looked at it?
Well, I'm not a voting member, and the committee's the master of their own destiny. They decide what they're going to do, and they haven't voted yet on Mr. Vierson's motion, but I think it's coming up
they keep
shortly.
voting to defer it, so.
As a co-chair, though, isn't there something you can do to kind of push it along?
It's pretty quick and easy to say, listen, let's just do a quick vote. Yeah, we need to get the PCO here for a meeting to talk about what's going on. And they, you know, so to say that, oh, they haven't voted yet when they keep voting to defer it, I think is a little bit disingenuous. It's time to get the PCO before the committee as one piece of the puzzle. But the other piece of the puzzle is the minister has to look at all these red flags and say, what are we going to do?
And that's what the minister is doing. The minister has received the interim report. The minister's office is reviewing the report. There's a working group within PCO that's looking at the administrative issues that may be causing some of the problems, and they're looking to fix the problems. Ultimately, this is about the victims and making sure that we, as a government and the commission, has all the tools they need to do the victims justice. And we're not just focusing on the commission's work. We're doing work right now in communities to make sure that communities are safer. I know I spoke to the Justice Minister recently about some programs in my region about keeping victims safe and making sure we deal with the root problems in the criminal justice system. So there's work happening right across the country. There's good work that's happening from organizations, and we're supporting that work.
Let's talk more about this Privy Council Office barrier, though. Public Accounts Committee twice has had the Privy Council Office at committee to talk about how it's facilitating the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's Inquiry, how it's managing spending. I was on the Indigenous Affairs Committee this week. I was fairly stunned, actually, how fast the Liberal majority on committee said, no, we closed debate, we don't even want to discuss this. Then they tried to go in camera, no justification to go in camera, to talk about the role of the Privy Council Office administering the funds for the inquiry. What do they have to hide? I was really struck by that. I have never seen another committee be so protective of this, parliamentary bureaucracy. If it's going so well, bring the bureaucrats to come and talk to us about how they're managing the funds, which are meant to be spent on the families.
Mr. Rusnick, I mean, we've had reports that there's a toxic work culture there. We've had nearly 24 resignations and firings since the committee began. I suppose when is enough and we have to do something. Or if we do nothing, I suppose the recommendations may not be taken seriously.
Well, like I said, we're not doing nothing. The PCO has a working group, and they're looking at the interim report. The minister is also reviewing the interim report, and we're helping. The government will be coming out with responses to the interim report. But again, we have to focus on everything in communities to make sure that we're not just doing one thing. We're working on housing. We're working on shelters for women. We're working on safe water. We're working on improving the justice system and how it deals with Indigenous communities.
I mean, you mentioned it, and the minister mentioned it in her answer yesterday about this working group. I mean, what does this working group do other than make sure, I suppose, the bills get paid on time?
Well, I think they're looking at they're reviewing the interim report and the issues that the commissioners have addressed, but looking at administrative efficiencies and how they can better support the work of the commission. I don't have a working knowledge of what the working group is actually doing, but the administrative delays that have been identified in the report are being considered.
Is this something the committee should know about, is what this working group is doing?
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, hopefully the ministers are going to be before committee next week, and hopefully that'll be an opportunity for us to find out from them what they're doing and what they're going to do to put it back on track. So hopefully we're going to have some good answers when they come to committee next week. So we're certainly looking forward to both Minister Philpott, Minister Bennett coming and answering directly some questions. And that's the biggest issue, is this is important, and you know, it is right. We've all said this has to be successful, but when you have red flag after red flag, and you have the Liberals not wanting to have the PCO come before committee, you know, you just start to really worry, and you hear reports that you know, the staff are told, let's make the commissioners look good. It's not about making commissioners look good. This is about giving peace and resolution to families.
Was this a Liberal promise that maybe was rushed too quickly and not thought out enough?
You know, I think they had committed for a long time, so I'm not going to say it was not thought out well enough. You know, one thing, and I've said it on the show like when the commission was first launched, the fact that they didn't have an additional process that would allow a little bit of a review of, you know, when they hear something that was really concerning and that they thought that some expertise in terms of cold files, in terms of, you know, how things were handled, they didn't have any process around that. We identified that on the show probably a year ago, and I noticed that the commission has identified that now as a gap. So, you know, that piece is one that to me was a very logical part of what they should have been doing, is having a group that was available to review.
Ms. Malcolmson, I suppose after a year, after all these resignations, the troubles that, you know, one of the commissioners resigned, of course, how much credibility will this have when they finally do come up with a final report?
This is up to the families, really. We've got very strong women's organizations across the country. They're the real drivers of having the inquiry happen at all. Native Women's Association of Canada, the inquiry would not have happened without them. I'm discouraged by how little some of that grassroots, family-based expertise has been drawn on, both by the government and by the commissioners. But we'll be taking our cues from the families that have come before the inquiry, have taken the brave step of telling their stories. And we'll be taking, as New Democrats, we'll be taking our cues from them about how, what weight to put on the results of the inquiry. In the meantime, we'll be continuing to press the government to keep their promise and support the inquiry in the best way they can.
Would more time and money at this point turn things around?
I think it sounds like from the criticism we've heard from the families, that more time and money is not the answer, that there's something more systemic that needs to change.
Your opinion on whether more time and money is needed for this?
You know, I look at the TRC, and it was 5 years, so it was substantially more time, but it was not a lot more money. It was $60 million. The inquiry has $54 million in a 2-year time frame. So, you know, I think perhaps to have had a little bit more time was appropriate, but I agree. If you have difficult systemic issues, it doesn't matter how much time, you're going to compound the problem. So the government needs to listen to the red flags. They need to get this back on track, and we need to move forward.
And again, Mr. Rusnick, does it need to be back on track? I don't think, it doesn't seem coming from the government that they feel it's off the track.
Well, we have the interim report. The minister's reviewing that report, and there's also the working group within PCO. Until all that work is done, I don't have answers on how we're going to address some of the issues that you identified. Making political hay out of this issue, I think, is problematic. One thing we need to do is support the victims, and the minister understands that. So all the
taking political hay.
well, we need to do this right, and the minister's reviewing the interim report. The PCO has a working group. We're going to make sure we get this right.
Okay, that's it. I wish we had more time to talk about this in particular, but we don't. Thank you again for joining me. Thank you. Coming up after the break, Auditor General Michael Ferguson will be here to discuss his latest report. Welcome back. This is Nation to Nation. The Auditor General's fall report came out earlier this week. And while Canada Revenue and the Phoenix Pay System are grabbing the headlines, 2 of the 6 reports are of particular interest to Indigenous people. One was on oral health programs for First Nations and Inuit, and the other on preparing female offenders to leave federal prison. Join me now is the Auditor General of Canada, Michael Ferguson. Welcome to our show.
Thank you very much.
Now, first off, we'll start with the oral health programs. What did your audit find with the oral health programs aimed at First Nations and Inuit?
Well, I think there were 2 things. We did find some administrative issues in there, which I'll explain. But I think the main message in there is, first of all, First Nations people in Inuit have twice the level of dental disease as the rest of Canadians. Okay, so the health outcomes for those populations is significantly worse than the health outcomes, the dental health outcomes for the rest of Canadians. And what we found was, while Health Canada provides this program, or their programs providing dental services to First Nations and Inuit, they really weren't sure whether the program was actually helping to close that gap or not, right? So they were doing a good job of administering payments and administering individual transactions, but they weren't paying attention to whether what they were doing was actually going to close the gap. They had one initiative, the Children's Oral Health Initiative, which was only available on about half of First Nations. It was aimed at children 7 years of age and younger, to provide them with preventative dental health care. That program, in fact, was having an impact. They knew that it was having an impact, but they didn't have their enrollment levels where they needed to be. For example, children aged 5 to 7, they wanted 70% of those children enrolled in the program. They were only at 40%. And the other thing was, based on their numbers, it looked like the enrollment was in fact declining. So here you have a program that seemed to be actually having an impact on the oral health of the people that it was serving, but according to their numbers, the enrollment was declining. Okay, so that's the number one message, is that overall they need to really understand not just are they paying for services and what services are they paying for, but are they doing things that will help close the gap on those health outcomes. Again, where for the First Nations and Inuit people, they have twice the level of dental disease as the other populations in Canada. There were also some administrative issues. One, for example, was Health Canada says that for a pre-approval of a procedure, so there are some procedures that the dentist can't just provide, or the dental professional can't just provide, they have to be pre-approved. The department says they will provide that authorization within 10 days. So as an individual, you would think, okay, I have a service or a procedure that needs to be pre-approved, I should get an answer within 10 days. But they weren't measuring it from the point of view of each individual. They were looking at it sort of overall. So some people may be waiting longer than 10 days and others less than 10 days. But from an individual's point of view, they think they should only wait 10 days.
Now, of course, this was all under Health Canada before. It's now going to be transferred over to Indigenous Services. They'll be looking after these programs. Do you expect to see a better result now that Indigenous Services is looking after it?
Well, I hope what they do is realize there are 2 ways that they have to look at this. There's a transactional way, but then there's also looking at it from the point of the health outcome. Okay, so certainly I hope they understand to put those 2 focuses on it. We've been doing a lot of audits that touch on a lot of issues for Indigenous people, and quite frankly, we always see very slow progress on these files, in the years after our audit. So I certainly hope that we will see progress on this file, but that will be a bit of a change from what we've seen on other audits that we've done.
I'm going to switch gears a bit here, and your report also, one of the reports was on females being prepared for release from federal corrections. What are some of the highlights from that report?
Well, in terms of Indigenous women that are in federal penitentiary, one of the things particularly that we identified was that correction services can't always give them access to the culturally appropriate correctional programming that they need to help prepare them for release, to help them prepare them for parole. So in fact we found that the Indigenous women who were participating in culturally appropriate correctional programming actually waited longer to get parole. And as a whole, Indigenous women, fewer Indigenous women were getting parole at their first eligibility date than non-Indigenous women. And also, that some of the particular programming available for Indigenous female offenders isn't available across the country, healing lodges and some of those things. So, I think in terms of Indigenous women offenders, the Correctional Services needs to really identify what services are actually available to them and how they can get access to those culturally appropriate services.
Of course, the report really didn't talk about the overrepresentation of Indigenous women in prisons. You mentioned 36% in the report. Since that time, probably it's actually gone up to almost 38%. House Committee on the Status of Women is about to look into this issue. Overall of Indigenous women in incarceration, do you expect, again, that the government is starting to take this issue a little more seriously?
Well, again, I think as an auditor, we always wait to see, and see what happens. But I think certainly, this idea of making sure that they understand what programming is, most suitable for Indigenous women is something that they need to pay attention to. Where the correctional services can influence sort of the, who's in their custody is by getting people prepared for release. Obviously, they don't influence who's coming in their door, but where they can have an influence is getting those offenders prepared for parole at their earliest possible date, which is important because that's what lets people, offenders, whether they be men or women, that's what lets them have a longer, more gradual transition back into the community once they do get out of the facility.
Yeah, well, we can talk certainly more about these two reports. Again, thank you for coming on the show and explaining them more to us.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back after another short break. Welcome back. Well, that's it for Nation to Nation tonight. But before we go, we've learned that Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott and Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett will appear before the House's Committee on Indigenous Affairs. So a week from today, they're going to be questioned about the inquiry. And we didn't have time for it, but if you want to see what the political panel had to say about Bill C-262, the implementation of the UN's Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, go to aptnnews.ca. I'm Todd Lam. Have a great evening.